The reality that weapons, so omnipotent that they could cause millions of deaths for years after their detonation, influenced two world powers in the 1960s and 70s to come together with the objective of reaching an agreement on these weapons of mass destruction. Two nations, divided by political and socio-economic differences, negotiated between themselves a compromise for the greater safety of the world. At a time in human history when international tensions were at their height, the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics met to negotiate new limits on their inventory of nuclear weapons. This was the first time following the end of World War II in which these two superpowers put their minds together instead of against one another. These strategic arms limitation talks were influential encounters between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States in which they exchanged their ideas on arms limitation policies in a time of heated nuclear tensions, opening the door to further arms negotiations in the coming decades. With the end of World War II, Europe found itself split into two regions of communism and anti-communism divided by an Iron Curtain, a phrase coined by the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in 1946. As a result of the atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to bring an end to the war in the Pacific, the world embarked on a nuclear arms race so that each nation could be prepared in case full-on nuclear war broke out. As each nation's inventory of nuclear weapons increased, the fear of mutually assured destruction became a part of everyday life. The two main players in this arms race were the United States and the USSR, who had continuously been increasing funding on armaments. This arms race created conflicts between these rival nations, resulting in decades of resentment between the world powers in an era known as the Cold War. During this time, the relations grew in hostility until tensions came to a culmination when the Soviets implanted nuclear weapons in Cuba in October 1962, in what Americans now know as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The realization of how close the world was to detonation struck fear in the eyes of the people and caused them to seek peace over superiority.
Shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
However, in 1969, delegates from these two rival nations met in Helsinki, Finland, and began discussing plans for an agreement on arms limitation, starting the SALT talks, which would continue into the next decade. SALT I, as it was called, commenced on November 17, 1969 in the capital of Finland with the primary goal of establishing a future time where the two countries would meet to discuss in full the desired limits on weapons of mass destruction. The two documents that made up the SALT I Treaty were the Treaty on Anti-Ballistic Missiles and Interim Agreement and Protocol on Limitation of Strategic Offensive Weapons. Both treaties were signed into effect at a summit meeting in Moscow on May 26, 1972, by President Richard Nixon of the United States and Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, thus ending the SALT I talks. Essentially, SALT I was a pledge from both the U.S. and the USSR that allowed for further negotiations on a wider range of weapons systems and the immediate freezing of strategic arms supplies. Prior to the SALT I agreement, the Soviet auxiliary consisted of around 1,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBM for short. The United States supply contained 1,054 ICBMs and 656 SLBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The Soviets continued to manufacture ICBMs during the SALT I years, rising to approximately 1,500, while the U.S. had not increased their strategic missile count since 1967. However, the United States was working on a new program that incorporated MIRVs, or Multiple Independently Targeted Re-Entry Vehicles, into their nuclear arsenal, giving the U.S. an advantage in the total number of warheads. Much of the focus throughout the negotiations was based on the restriction of ABMs, while some discussion included ideas about limiting offensive weapons systems. The United States platform, contrary to the Soviet platform, found that to limit ABM systems while allowing unrestricted offensive weapons growth wouldn't agree with the main objectives of SALT. This eventually led to the Interim Agreement and Protocol on Limitation of Strategic Offensive Weapons, which would call for later discussions on ICBMs and SLBMs.
The governments of the United States and the Soviet Union, after reviewing the course of their talks on the limitation of strategic armaments, have agreed to concentrate this year on working out an agreement for the limitation of the deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems, ABMs. They have also agreed that together with concluding an agreement to limit ABMs, they will agree on certain measures with respect to the limitation of offensive strategic weapons.
The SALT talks would continue just months after, as SALT II began with discussions in Geneva, Switzerland in November 1972. While it would be signed on June 18, 1979 by President Jimmy Carter and General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, it would take 3 U.S. Senate committees 7.5 months to decide not to ratify the agreement. The main purpose of the SALT II negotiations was to set limits on specific offensive weapons that had been overlooked in the SALT I treaty. The new weapon systems that limitations were placed on included ICBMs, SLBMs, and MIRVs. The treaty set a ceiling at 2,400 strategic nuclear delivery vehicles, but later decided that by the end of 1981, the limit should drop to 2,250. Furthermore, agreed limitations were placed on any MIRV'd ballistic missiles. While these negotiations were completed and signed by the leading diplomats of both parties, the United States Senate never agreed to ratify the treaty due to Soviet mobilization into Afghanistan. This action by the Soviets resulted in a massive feeling of distrust toward them, promptly leading to President Carter's urging of the Senate to table the discussion. Despite the ultimate failure of the treaty's ratification process, this was still an important precedent for future arms limitation between these rival nations.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
With the USSR's grasp on Eastern Europe loosening, the United States and USSR took a page out of the SALT book and began a third term of arms reduction discussions, resulting in the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, referred to as START. This was signed on July 31, 1991, and was put into effect on December 5, 1994, and carried out the initiatives which the two parties had set out to achieve in the SALT II treaty. This included the agreements to cut strategic nuclear weapon deployment by 30 to 40%, and significant limitations on other offensive weapons systems. START was followed by START II, START III, and New START in the years 1993, 1997, and 2011 respectively. In these treaties, both nations exchanged their opinions and ideas as a result of the evolution of nuclear weapons systems, specifically offensive weapons. These talks revived the common need for a peaceful relationship between superpowers who have had a history of disagreement and helped to prevent mutually assured destruction. While both nations had the arsenal to decimate one another, they took the high road and maintained peacefulness through their adversities.
If we succeed, this joint statement that has been issued today may well be remembered as the beginning of a new era in which all nations will devote more of their energies and their resources, not to the weapons of war, but to the works of peace.